What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are closed. We're having some tech issues that we're trying to deal with here. And before I go any further, as I mentioned at the top of the program, on my show on Thursday, we're going to have our third hour guest is going to be Phil Turney and Dave Kahari talking about the Liberty. I've just been informed that Phil Turney is going to be guest hosting the National Intel Report that follows my program. So that's going to be a lot of radio for Phil to be doing here. And so after you're done listening to my show on Thursday, just don't touch that dial. And the National Intel Report is going to be spending all of their time on the USS Liberty. And it is something we need to make a big deal about it, because we are sick and tired of being lied to and tricked and having our young people just murdered in cold blood for political gain. Now, getting on back to the London terror attacks and all of this nonsense about grabbing for more power and authority, Theresa May has literally said she will rip up human rights laws in order to fight terror. You don't need to rip up human rights laws to fight terror. Close the borders. No matter what happens, act of terror, traffic accident, hailstones, what do? We've got to take away more of your rights and freedoms. Sorry, it's the only way we can do. Ridiculous. Now, Hillary Clinton, and this may be one of the reasons they wanted to go away. You're not going to believe this. We put up the video at whatreallyhappened.com where Hillary is out there and saying that the best way you can stop terrorism is you need to understand other cultures' food. I'm not kidding. She actually said that. I take it back. She's not plotting to overthrow Trump and take over the White House. She's turned into a crazy old lady. And she's an embarrassment. And I'm not surprised that the Democratic leadership wants her to fade away, because as long as she's out there flapping her gums, she is going to be a serious liability for next year's midterm elections and 2020. Now, as you know, there was a little bit of an upset at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The police responded to it as if it was a terror attack, but apparently it turned out somebody, for some reason, maybe prescription antidepressants, attacked a police officer with a hammer. The police officer shot them. And they closed down the cathedral, said, everybody stay away, there could be more hammer-wielding, whatever. Meanwhile, an ISIS-linked media group, meaning a propaganda front, is threatening new attacks in France. They're really ramping up the terror booga-booga, and I'm concerned, again, the false flags, if they're not getting traction with the little false flags, they're going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Because the forces that are behind this agenda, pushing for a global war and a global government afterwards, they're not going to quit. They've gone too far. They've spent too much money. They're just going to keep pushing until they get what they want or they come crashing down. Meanwhile, over at Twitter, an Al Nusra Twitterer is blaming Putin for the London Bridge attack. See, this is an aspect of politics you need to keep in mind. No matter what happens, everybody's going to say, how can I further my agenda with this? And, of course, out here in the real world, when you see all these different competing, contrasting claims, they tend to cancel each other out. And that's why the current propaganda isn't working all that effectively and efficiently. See, for propaganda to work, it has to present a narrative, a cohesive, coherent, believable alternative reality to mask out the real reality. And when you have all this propaganda, it's being designed by advertising agencies and public relations firms, where it's basically get out this idea, get out this story, then you erase the blackboards and you start all over again with something else. And you get contradictions, you get stuff that just doesn't make any sense, and that's why it's not getting the traction that they want. Now, one of the big questions, of course, is did the Manchester bombing and the London Bridge terror attacks, were they done to try and influence the elections? And certainly we're already seeing that in places like articles, Tory record on terrorism, very weak, deeply worrying. This is coming from Russia Today. So they're already out there trying to use this for the elections. And there was another very interesting article. This one came out of The Nation, said, after a terrorist attack, Spain rejected its hawks. Will Britain? And they're basically talking about how back in 2004, just a few days before a critical election, a series of nearly simultaneous bombs exploded on 4 commuter trains in Madrid, killing over 190 people. Before the bombing, the Socialist Party was 5 points behind in the polls, and it ended up winning by 5 points. So we might actually see a surprise result from the British election later this week here. The British media, as biased and corrupt as the American media, apparently is ignoring Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Apparently he had a huge rally, a lot of people showed up, and the BBC ignored it, much as our corporate media tried to ignore and trivialize and dismiss and downplay the huge rallies for Donald Trump. And again, every time Hillary Clinton starts talking about how she actually won the popular vote, I keep looking at the photos of Hillary's rallies. She's got maybe a couple of hundred people there, and Donald Trump selling out sports arenas, standing room only. I think there was massive election fraud last year for Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump, but it was not able to overcome the landslide for him. I think if they could ever sort out what actually did happen last year, we would find that Donald Trump just had a huge, huge landslide victory. All right, we're going to do a shout-out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. And a reminder, we are not taking phone calls today because we're having some communications problems between Republic Broadcasting and here on the island of Oahu. So let's talk about the war zones because things are getting very intense there. And as I reported earlier in the show, apparently the Arab states around Qatar are now establishing a naval blockade. So it looks like the war to regime change Qatar is definitely on. The wild card in the pile, though, are all those U.S. forces stationed in Qatar. If the government of Qatar is feeling that the U.S. is behind this, they might use them as hostages or human shields. I can imagine Qatar's rulers are feeling very panicked right now. Over in Deir ez-Zor, Syria, apparently army units are clashing with more of these ISIS-affiliated terrorist groups. Apparently the ISIS groups do have some drones, and the Syrian army was able to shoot one of them down. Be interesting to see where it came from. Now, this is a very serious situation. The U.S.-led coalition destroys pro-Syrian government forces within the deconfliction zone. And what's really interesting is the U.S. has come on out, the Pentagon has come on out saying the coalition does not seek to fight the Syrian regime or pro-regime forces, but we must defend ourselves if pro-regime forces refuse to vacate the deconfliction zone. In other words, the U.S. has carved off a chunk of Syria and said, don't come on in here. And I'm going to take a wild guess here that the Syrian government has never agreed to these deconfliction zones, nor did the pro-Syrian forces. It's just an arbitrary declaration of, we're going to kill anything that comes in here. And as in point of fact, yes, the U.S. has been trying to take down Assad for 5 years now, plus. So don't tell us you're not seeking a conflict with the Syrian government forces because you've been in conflict with the Syrian government forces for 5 years. Now, do you remember almost a year ago, the corporate media was out there with this video of a young Syrian boy injured in a blast and allegedly being saved by the white helmets, and it was one of these many claims that Assad was attacking civilians. And a lot of people scratched their heads and said the video and the photos didn't really look all that convincing because supposedly there had been an airstrike by Syrian aircraft on this house of civilians who opposed Assad. But in the background, you didn't see anybody going through the rubble looking for potential survivors. And you didn't even really see them doing all that much to take care of this wounded boy. He had some bandages on him. And it was a presentation of Assad's cruelty and indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Well, the little boy then vanished thereafter, and it turns out he and his family went into hiding. Well, now they've come out of hiding, and the father is doing interviews, And basically what he's saying is, first of all, that he and his family and everybody in that area were pro-Assad. There was no airstrike. Somebody just set off some explosives on the ground, and he was bribed and threatened to let his son be used for propaganda purposes. It was a complete fake. The white helmets faked all of it. And this is big news all over the media in the Middle East. And, of course, you will not hear a single word of it on the American corporate media. It's another fake, another fraud. How many more times do you have to be lied to until you're ready to scream and say, you guys are full of it and I'm not going to listen to you anymore? Okay. Looks like my server may be having some issues. I'll have to get to that next commercial break. Now then, the U.S.-led coalition has set up a second military base on Syria's border with Iraq. They're trying to take control of that border. And apparently another U.S. military convoy has entered Syria from Iraq. And what they're going to do is they're positioning these new U.S. forces around the Kurdish forces to try and discourage Turkey and Russia from attacking the Kurds, who are trying to carve out the new Kurdistan. Basically, the U.S. government is betting that neither Turkey nor Russia will risk hitting American forces, who are being used as human shields for the Kurds. Russia won't. I'm not so sure about Turkey. Turkey is not very much fond of the United States after that failed coup d'etat. Now, fresh from his appearance at the Bilderberg meeting, McMaster is urging yet another surge in Afghanistan, even though the last surge did not really work, and the surge before that really did not work, and the surge before that really did not work. Getting on back to that definition of insanity. And basically, McMaster is still out there trying to push for more engagement in Afghanistan. Can you say quagmire? I knew you could. Now, one of our callers, when we were still able to take calls today, called on in about this. Apparently, a Russian Sukhoi 27 fighter jet was scrambled to intercept a U.S. B-52 strategic bomber over the Baltic Sea. And basically, they're saying that the U.S. warplane was in neutral waters, but flying right along the edge of the Russian border. So, yeah, it's a provocation. The U.S. is trying to goad Russia into doing something that would open the door to outright war. Because that ruble must be destroyed if the U.S. dollar is ever going to become wonderful again. Or at least that's their thing. Defense Secretary James Mattis has remarked recently that a war with North Korea would be tragic on an unbelievable scale. Experts are looking at how the original Korean War went. They're not seeing a chance for much of a difference this time. There'd be a huge, huge body count. And, of course, it runs the risk of a nuclear disaster. And still, they're pushing. And, of course, the idea is that all of these people who want these wars, they're safe at home. They're safe in their bunkers, in their bank boardrooms, in their defense contractor offices. They don't have to worry about it. The rest of us do. Because we're expected to pay for it. We're expected to send our children off to be killed and crippled in it. And sometimes I do think they are caught up in a groupthink of the infallible U.S. military. Caught up in this idea that the U.S. never loses a war, except, of course, that we certainly lost Vietnam. And we didn't exactly win in Korea. And we haven't really exactly won much of these wars we're mired in now. We're holding ground, I think, at the most generous, is all you can say. Meanwhile, down in Africa, the European Union has agreed to hand over 43 million pounds to fund a new counter-terrorism force in Africa. Oh, there are terrorists in Africa. There's also a lot of natural resources down there that are undeveloped. But of course, you can't sell a war to the people by saying, well, we're going to invade Africa and we're going to grab all their gold and silver and tantalum and rare earth metals and uranium and all that other stuff. People are going to say, will you go grab it yourself? You leave my kid alone. Oh no, the new terror threat is Africa. Yes, we told you Qatar was the terror threat and then Iran was the terror threat and Iraq was but now it's Africa. We've got to go into Africa. They must think we're so gullible. And you know, when you have a government, and for that matter a corporate media, that lies to you like this, it's a sign of complete lack of respect for you as a thinking human being. You should be insulted every time you are fed another big steaming pile of USDA choice bovine excrement. You should feel insulted. You should be angry. It's time to get angry. To heck with anger management. Time to be ticked off, really, seriously. Alrighty, let's talk about the economy because things are heating up there as well. As you know, the banks in Spain are in serious trouble. Apparently their stocks are crashing, and there are growing rumblings that Spain may invoke a European Union law allowing them to engage in bail-ins. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means as opposed to a bail-out, a bail-in is permission for the bank to literally help themselves to savings accounts at that bank. And apparently they're talking about deposits of over 100,000 euros are going to basically be subject to partial confiscation by the bank to keep the bank solvent. Because as we all know, banks are much more important than human beings in the eyes of the world's governments. Human beings, we got too many of those. Who cares about them? But the banks, we must worship the banks. All should be sacrificed to the banks here. So if you're in Spain or if you have a savings account of any size over in Spain's banks, I would suggest getting your money out now. Because after the bail-in and things get worse, they'll lower that threshold. It'll be down to 50,000 euros. Then it'll be down to 1,000 euros. Then it'll be down to 12 cents. Don't wait for the last minute. Remember what happened over in Cyprus. They did the bank bail-ins and confiscations before the people even knew it was going to happen. They showed up, the bank doors were closed, the ATMs were shut down. By the time it reopened, their bank accounts had been subject to a haircut, or a scalping, or a castration, depending upon your point of view. Now, the International Monetary Fund has issued a warning that the U.S. economy is uncertain because China's credit growth poses a risk. And we're seeing all kinds of indicators out there. Toronto's housing bubble is exploding. There's going to be a crash in their real estate market. There are no buyers. And again, this is the downside of globalism. When it's all linked together, a major misstep in one part of the world drags the rest of the system down with it. That's what happened back in 2008 when the collapse of the U.S. mortgage-backed security fraud on Wall Street almost broke the banks of Europe. And you would have thought that somebody would have said, we need to put up some safety barriers. Oh, no. It's great having it all global. We can just move it all over just as fast as we want. This is good for business. It's dangerous. They don't want to see it. They're money junkies. They're so caught up in their addiction, just like drug addicts who engage in very dangerous personal behavior because all they can see is, I got to get that next fix. Money addiction is a real illness. It's the only one the pharmaceutical industry isn't making a pill for right now. But it affects all of us, even those of us who don't want to be money addicts. We're forced to just get into that same mad dash and scramble for pieces of paper and ink. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're still not taking phone calls, trying to find out why we're having these tech issues. Too many knobs, too many buttons, too many switches, all the rest of that. Now, getting on back to the economy, over in Europe, Brussels, despite all the talk about how wonderful things are and the euro's this and the euro's that, Brussels is now admitting that 1 in 4 people inside the European Union are living on the verge of poverty, and that they're actually looking at years of instability. Well, yes, of course. Private central banking is naturally unstable. You cannot make it work for an extended period of time without all the wealth winding up in the pockets of the bankers. That's the way it's designed. That's what it's supposed to do. And a lot of the people of Europe are starting to understand that it is that European Central Bank and the IMF and the rest of the money junkies that are plundering and looting the world. Now, there are those who think that's the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be great. Joe Biden is out there saying he personally fought to keep Greece under the control of the European Union debt loads. And apparently he was boasting about how he played a key role in keeping Greece in the European Union and blocking the Grexit. Now remember, when Tsipras ran for the presidency of Greece, he campaigned on a promise of Grexit, and then as soon as he was in, somehow he was blocked from doing it. By the way, the latest extortion for yet another bailout, which is just another loan, is apparently Greece will be forced to sell their public water utilities into private ownership under this plan coming from the European Union. Privatization, as we already know, means poorer service and higher prices, because it's no longer a utility that serves a public need, it's just another for-profit enterprise. Whether it's water, whether it's currency, whether it's electricity, if it's privatized, it means higher prices for ordinary people. Here's where it all breaks down. The people of Greece don't have that money. Neither do the people of Europe, a quarter of them. Neither do the people here in the United States. We're reaching a point where it doesn't matter how much they grab, there's nothing left out here for them to grab onto. Here in the United States of America, we've been talking about now the over 100 million Americans legally able, willing to work, who have not been able to find jobs. And we're turning into a welfare state on top of that. Apparently, according to this article that came out of Natural News, a record 236 million people are collecting some form of assistance from the government. You cannot look at that number and say that we have a healthy, functioning economy. It is simply impossible. Now, for the government, having the entire population dependent on them is a good way of making sure those people don't stand up and say, hey, I think you're doing a lousy job. Remember, dependency is slavery. Next month is Independence Day. And you should start seriously thinking about what that means, why we call it Independence Day, as opposed to Freedom Day, Liberty Day, We Kick the British Butt Day, or any other name. There's a specific reason. It's called Independence Day. Now, as we've mentioned before, if you're watching on TV, you're seeing all these commercials for cars, and the prices are amazing. If anybody actually did have money, this is a wonderful time to be buying a car. But right now, the auto inventories are building up. They're trying to keep the factories going. They're trying to keep the people employed. And they're just building up a huge inventory of cars. At the current rate of new car sales, they're not going to finish selling all the new 2016 cars until the last week of August. At which point, they're going to start pushing the 2017. But they've got this huge backlog. Remember Reagan and his cheese? They had a huge surplus of cheese, so Reagan just said, well, we're just going to send it out to everybody for free. Won't that be a wonderful thing? Do it with the cars. I know a lot of people who need cars. I need a car. So, it's another indicator. We're going to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And again, we are not taking phone calls. We're still trying to deal with some technical issues that make it... you're getting my sound feed apparently very clear, but the feed coming back from RBN to my studio here in Oahu is very badly garbled. So, as our infrastructure declines to third world level here. All right, we're talking about the economic news. And we know that there are cities all across America that are going into bankruptcy. Now we're hearing about states going into bankruptcy. Article at governmentslaves.com. Connecticut is on the verge of collapse. And what we're seeing here is that all this talk about record tax revenues, somebody's fibbing somewhere, because you keep getting all of this news about 5% unemployment, record tax collections, everything's all hunky-dory, and yet all around us we see things are just getting worse and heading to an absolute crisis. They're talking about Hawaii having to go into bankruptcy, maybe later this year. So the light rail project has turned into this incredible boondoggle. And it all comes down to the fact that if your general population is not able to trade their labor for decent wages and salaries, then they can't go buy the new cars. They can't go to the shopping malls and buy new TVs. They can't pay their bills in many cases. They can't pay their taxes in many cases. When you have a fascist economy, sooner or later it has to self-destruct, because that recycling mechanism that will take the wealth accumulated at the top and bring it back down to the bottom to feed back in is gone. That's the difference between capitalism and fascism. And as I've said many times before, Vladimir Lenin predicted when Western capitalism failed, it would turn into fascism to protect the wealth and power of those at the very, very top. Now, there's been an interesting development. As you know, a lot of people talk about North Dakota's public bank and how public banks really do seem to work to support the public good, as opposed to these privatized banks that are all about looting and plundering and keeping us all their debt slaves. And apparently more cities are starting to look at setting up their own public banks. And I'm looking at this one story that came on out from BillMoyers.com, talking about Philadelphia, which is trying to cut the city's ties with Wells Fargo because of the scandals that have been hitting Wells Fargo and so many other banks regarding the fraudulent accounts scandal. And Wells Fargo settled for $25 billion for foreclosure abuse, $1.2 billion for improper mortgage lending practices, $184 million in compensation for steering Black and Latino borrowers onto predatory subprime mortgages. And yet nobody went to jail. Wells Fargo's management just shoved it off onto, it was the lower staff. They were doing this on their own. Now, former CEO John Stump finally stepped down, but he never returned any of his pay that he made during all of these crimes. In fact, he left with a $133 million severance package. So cities are starting to say, if all of these big banks are criminal, and we keep hearing all the time about all these settlements of drug money laundering and the rest of it, let's set up our own bank. There's no reason not to. And we're seeing this in cities all across the country. They're starting to say, we don't want to do business with these big banks. We always lose. Let's set up our own public bank to take care of the city and its people. There's no law against it. Obviously, the Federal Reserve doesn't like it. They can't do a thing about it. I think it's an idea as time has come. I think if we can get one thing out of this mess that we are all in right now, I hope when we come out on the other side of whatever it is that is about to happen, that the world will realize that privatized anything that should be a need for the people, it's just a form of enslavement. And private central banking has had a 300-year run. It's made the Rothschilds incredibly wealthy, on paper, at the expense of everybody else. When we talk about the blueprint for the new America, and we talk about modifying the Constitution and moving forward, I want right up there at the very top of that, no more private central banking. There shouldn't have been a private central bank anyway. Our current Constitution does not authorize the government to delegate the process of currency creation to a third party. The Federal Reserve is, on the face of it, unconstitutional. Now, we've also been talking about cable TV, usually in the context of corporate media. And they're losing audience. But apparently, according to this article that came out of Ars Technica, cable TV is failing as a business. They're complaining about rising programming costs, people switching to online video streaming, and that is a factor. People want to watch what they want to watch when they have the time to watch it. But there is another factor. They talk about rising programming costs. There isn't a lot of new stuff out there. At least here on Oahu, our Time Warner Cable, which is now Spectrum, it's a real task trying to find something on that program guide we have not already seen time and time again. And unfortunately, a lot of the new pay-per-views coming on out, they're not that interesting. There's so many remakes out there. They're remaking Orient Express again. The last one was wonderful. How do you try and improve on that? We're actually, in many ways, we're seeing a repeat of what happened during the height of the McCarthy era, where there was this program to purge Hollywood of anybody who was an independent thinker who wasn't going to go along with the plan to demonize the Soviet Union and help support the new Cold War. And in the process, they drove some of their most creative people out of the industry. And film production kind of went into a slump where it was all remakes and retakes and just rehashing of things that used to work. And I think it's happened again. Now, these days, about a decade ago, it was purge entertainment of anybody who isn't a supporter of Israel. And now they're back to saying anybody who's an aide of Russia, get rid of them. And it's almost like our pop culture has stagnated. And not just film and TV. I go around the radio dial. And it's all formulaic. It all sounds the same. There's nothing really original out there. Now, people look back with nostalgia at the music of the 60s, and it certainly wasn't the quality of the music. Certainly, compared to today, the recording technology was very, very primitive. It was the content. It was the thought that was in the lyrics. And that has now been scrubbed away. By the way, there's a very cool movie out, and you'll find it somewhere in your dial. It's called Pirate Radio. And it's talking about where rock and roll was literally banned in Great Britain, and rock and roll was being broadcast from radio transmitters on ships at sea. And this really did, in fact, happen. And if you've ever heard of Sealand, it's this abandoned radar platform in the Atlantic that this family took over and literally declared an independent nation. It actually began as one of the pirate rock and roll transmitters. And then, of course, eventually Britain woke up and realized rock and roll was a huge success. Much of it was coming from Great Britain, and they could make money with it. And Britain rebranded as the capital of rock and roll. We had the Beatles, we had this, we had Piccadilly. But it often feels like listening to the radio today, it's all been scrubbed of anything that might get you to think, those double plus ungood thoughts. It makes it boring. I don't play the radio anywhere near as much as I used to. I wish we had an all-news, all-the-time station here in Oahu. Anyway, getting on back to the economy. Article coming out of The Guardian talking about how it's one thing to look at that top 1% or the 1/10 of 1% who are just getting insanely wealthy by rigging the system to just force money upward to them. But this article is saying the real problem, though, isn't that 1% or 1/10 of 1%, because in the end they're not actually taking that much out from the rest of the economy. They're saying it's that top 1/5, the top 20%, that are starting to get into money junkie thinking, and they're hoarding and pulling in and starting to play the same games. And there are enough of them where it does have a significant effect on the remaining 80% of the population. The wealth inequality is seriously out of control. And that wealth inequality is another way for saying that the bottom levels of our society, the workers, the middle class, the lower middle class, are not able to trade their labor for new wealth to pump back into the system. You cannot have an economy that's functioning with this much wealth inequality. It's heading for a crash. They're holding it off by just printing new money, which increases inflationary pressures. Everything they're doing is a patch. It's a Band-Aid. Nobody wants to actually look at the fundamental reasons why our economy is spinning out of control, because the money junkies make their money by an out-of-control economy. Over at the top of whatreallyhappened.com, up in that little gray submenu below the top, there's a link to the What Really Happened banker articles all in one chunk. You may want to take a look through that. And it includes links to All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, the 11th Marble, and there are a couple of other articles in there that really look to the fact that the people who profit most from our economic system don't want a steady, predictable economy. They love volatility. They love chaos. They love to play the chaos for speculative gain. Wall Street's just this giant open-air casino, and it was not supposed to be that way. The idea was that you would go down to the stock market and you would invest in, originally, farmers' stock, livestock. That's where it got its name. And then when the stock grew up and was harvested, you would share in the proceeds from the sale. And when they started applying this same principle to business development, it was the same thing. You would invest in a company that was starting up or expanding, and when the company sold its product and made a profit, you would share in that profit. And that was how it was supposed to work. It wasn't supposed to be this, we're going to buy this stock today and then game the system so it goes up to $1,000 tomorrow, then we'll sell on out. It's called speculation. It's called gambling. And it has led to some of the worst economic disasters in our history, including the crash of the 1930s. 1929, actually. Now, further undermining the U.S. dollar's hegemonic domination of the world, apparently the Bank of Russia is going to test out blockchain technology for cross-border communication in the financial sphere with the member states of the European Union. Remember, they're starting to set up their own parallel systems to SWIFT. Now, SWIFT has, up until recently, been the system for global transfers of money around the world to serve business. But it's under U.S. control. And it's one of the things that allows the U.S. to have teeth in their sanctions, because they can go into that SWIFT system and simply say, you're cut off. And a lot of countries do not like living under that economic blackmail. And they're starting to set up their own parallel systems. And Russia, in fact, all of BRICS are doing just that. And this is the next step to set up the blockchain technology here. Now, turning over to the European Union, Angela Merkel had a little bit of a Freudian slip. And she was having a press conference with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And Angela Merkel spoke about German-Indian trade. Then she had to back up and say EU-Indian trade. And, of course, this is fueling Angela Merkel's critics, who say that she thinks Germany is actually in charge of the European Union now, meaning she is in charge of the European Union. And it would seem that the Freudian slip would indicate that as well. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin decided he was going to take a poke at Angela Merkel, and basically saying that Angela Merkel's recent outburst about not being able to rely on the United States anymore was an expression of her resentment over a limited sovereignty. In other words, Putin is poking fun at Merkel, saying that he, Putin, still enjoys the privilege of full sovereignty. He's not under any supranational organization. He gets to decide what's best for his country. Now then, as you know, several of the member states of the European Union are drawing a line regarding this runaway, out-of-control migration, especially in the wake of these terror attacks, which inevitably trace back to people who came into these host countries through this refugee program. Poland is saying they will accept no more. Czechoslovakia is saying they're not accepting any more refugees. The European Commission is already out there saying, we're going to sanction you, we're going to fine you huge amounts of money. I used to think that the EU was going to collapse because of the predatory banking of the European Central Bank, but it's looking more and more like the refugee, the migrant issue, is going to start tearing it apart. The question is Brussels really willing to go to war against Poland and Czechoslovakia over the refugee crisis? Is Germany willing to go along with Brussels and literally have a war within the European Union over the issue of the refugees? But Europe has definitely suffered because of this open border policy, the same as the United States has suffered over the open border policy. Now, out in California, and I want to preface this by saying, when Claire and I lived in California, and we lived there for a good portion of our life, Claire's originally from San Francisco, we did love it. I had a good time there, but it does seem like they're going crazy over there. Apparently, California is going to become the first state to extend health coverage to undocumented young adults aged 19 to 26 through the state's Medi-Cal coverage, which is funded by the taxpayers, to undocumented young adults. Sure, come to the United States, get free stuff. That's why we have an illegal immigration problem. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show today. Coming up on the top of the hour. We're still not taking phone calls. For some reason, my feed to RBN is doing great, and RBN's feedback to me is just deteriorating. So Mike is in the control room running around trying to figure out what's going on. Too many wires, too many buttons, too many switches here. Now, over the course of the Obama presidency, and especially when Hillary was campaigning, we saw firearm sales really take off. It was a good time for the citizens' gun companies, gun stores, and so forth. And the number of people filing for a firearm background check was often used as an indicator of public discontent with the politicians. So right now, Trump's detractors are trying to make a big deal over the fact that background checks are now soaring again. Gun sales are up, and they're trying to say, well, this is, we've got this NRA endorsed President Trump, and obviously if people are buying guns, well, then they're not sure they trust him, and blah, 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 blah. Well, there are other factors than the politicians out there. Trump is not the only issue. And given how he's flip-flopped on so many of his other campaign promises, there may be a little bit of concern that this nation is still headed in the same direction as it was under Obama and would have been under Hillary. But there are other factors. We still have an economy that looks like it's headed for a crash. And we have this rampant open borders problem, which has spawned a surge in crime and the potential for terror. Now, common sense gun policy is that in a nation where the police cannot prevent crime from happening, that citizens be allowed to have guns equal, if not superior, to those in the hands of the criminals. That's just common sense. And again, I come from a time where having a gun was normal. Schools had shooting clubs. We take our guns to school, put them in the cloakroom, because on the way home we stopped by the garden, chased the critters off. There were no mass shootings. Of course, they weren't doping us up on ADHD medication either. I really think that firearms safety courses should be a part of school curriculum. Teach these kids something useful. At the very least, you're going to avoid tragic accidents And then there was a story about apparently some kid graduating high school got a gun as a graduation gift and accidentally shot somebody. Why? Because he didn't know gun safety. He hadn't gone through the course. You don't hand a gun, especially a loaded one, to anybody without first saying, do you know how to clear a gun? Do you know how to handle this thing safely? It's not a toy. So, I mean, just to avoid accidental shootings, everybody going through school ought to be taught gun safety, the correct way to pick up a gun, clear the chamber, make sure the mag is out, and that the gun is safe to handle. Why can't we do that? What is the opposition to that? We'll be back after station identification.